So this is part 2 of our chapter 2 in our book, continuing on with stems and flowers. So the arrangement of stems, or the anatomy of stems, starts with discussion of nodes. And nodes are areas on stems where a leaf may emerge. It's also where we have branches emerging, and also we have buds located here on these particular structures. So you can see on this picture here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nodes, and a new one forming here at the terminal bud. The internode is the relatively inactive area between the nodes. So that's these spaces here. The length varies depending on the plant, the vigor, the conditions in the species, and this is where plants put on their height, is in these internodal sections where the stem elongates. Stems that are compressed just simply have short internodes. They still usually have all the same nodes as a plant that is not compressed. And elongated stems have longer internodes. Inside the stems are the vascular system, and these include the phloem, which is the portion of the vascular system or the plumbing oriented towards the epidermis or pointing towards the outside of the stem. And its job is to transport sugars in all directions, and a lot of that means transporting sugars to the roots. The xylem is the other part of the plumbing, and it carries water and nutrients from the roots, and it's oriented towards the inside or the center of the stem, as opposed to the phloem, which is oriented towards the outside. So you can see here in this picture, this lower part of these little vascular bundles here is the xylem, where it's a large opening, and then the smaller, more dense openings up top here on the grass stems are the phloem tissues. On dicots, which includes trees and shrubs, the xylem is this tissue located to the inside of the phloem here. This is the xylem, and here's the phloem here. And then sometimes there's pith, or kind of the spongy tissue on the inside of that. The actively growing region that creates the phloem and the xylem in dicots, particularly those that get secondary growth like woody plants, they have a cambium, which is dividing stems, an area of dividing cells that produces phloem to the outside and xylem to the inside. Pith, in the case of woody plants, becomes heartwood, which is very filled with tannins and other things to help keep the wood from decaying, and it serves as a structural support. So the cambium is a single cell layer. It's a growing point that separates the xylem and the phloem. In the case of the monocots, the cambium worked for a very short time to create a small pocket of phloem cells and 1 or 2 or maybe 3 xylem cells to the inside, and then it stops functioning, and each of those little vascular bundles had that actively growing region for just a short period of time. Wounds on woody plants in particular, shallow wounds will destroy the phloem. That is, they come in here and damage this area here, and so what that does is it prevents sugars from getting to the root system. If they're really deep wounds, they will get into the xylem, and that also disrupts, in addition to disrupting the sap flow or the sugar flow, it also disrupts the water flow. So buds are new stems, flowers, or leaves arising at a node. Flower and fruit buds often have a critical winter time and temperature rest requirement before they will bloom. This is especially true of fruit trees. Forsythia, as a flowering shrub, has a minimal requirement for this. It's pretty precocious in that sense. Peaches need to have 700 to 1,000 hours of temperatures below 45 degrees, and cherries need to have somewhat more than that before their flowers will be developed and they'll bloom. So buds are hardy until their rest period or their dormant period is broken, after which they're susceptible to frost. So if we have a warm period in January or February and then temperatures get very cold again, those buds start to come out of their dormancy or their rest period during the warm season, during the warm spell, and then they are quickly subjected to those freezing temperatures, and so many of them may die. On a particular stem, then just a woody plant stem, what we have here is we have buds that are latent buds, which are not necessarily present, or we don't see them anyway, but they're just inactive. These latent buds, also called lateral buds down here, are suppressed in many cases by the terminal bud up here, which produces a hormone called auxin that suppresses the development of these buds. So that gives rise to a term called apical dominance, where the apical portion of the stem kind of controls the shape of the plant and the shape of the branches by inhibiting to some degree the development of the branches below the terminal bud. So this tree here, which has been topped, which means that all of the major branches were just severely cut back, that has released its apical dominance and apical control that was inherent naturally, and the tree has just sprouted random branches that are very weakly attached and are prone to both breakage and a winter injury. So we don't advocate pruning trees in this way. So there are various types of stems. There's above ground stems, which includes many different types. There's crowns, spurs, stolons, thorns, tendrils. And then there's below ground stems, which includes tubers, rhizomes, bulbs, and corms. So we're going to talk about a few of these in a little bit more detail and explain what those are. A crown is a compressed stem. So crowns exist in many herbaceous plants. Grasses typically have these, as well as a lot of the herbaceous perennials like hosta, echinacea, daylilies, where there's many buds located at a common location right near the ground. And then those buds will continue to multiply and the crown will become bigger, which means sometimes we need to divide that crown if it gets too big. This is an example of a grass that is one clump of grass that has continually spread into a larger clump by forming a dense crown. A spur is a compressed stem of a woody plant that is adapted to fruit production. So in this example here, where the nodes aren't very far apart, but they're densely packed with flower buds. Here's an example in real life. And you can see here in this case, both of these are flowering spurs, and you can see how tightly those buds and those bud scars have been packed together on these tips, and that indicates that those are flowering stems, and that these buds here will produce flower buds. And so this is a flowering spur here. Stolons, also called runners, are elongated stems that lie along the ground, and they often root at nodes along those stems. An example of this is Bermuda grass. As you can see here, those above ground lateral moving stems are spreading out over the curb. So this is an aggressive, fairly aggressive spreading grass. Tubers are thick, fleshy stems which act like a storage organ. So potatoes are good examples of these. So it's hard to understand maybe that they're actually stems underground, but we know that they're actual stems and not part of the root system because they have buds on those potatoes or these tubers, and we call those eyes of the potatoes. So everywhere there's an eye, there's a bud that can either produce stems or roots. Rhizomes are underground horizontal stems, so they're similar to stolons, only they move underground instead of on top of the ground. And these plants also spread themselves out by producing roots and shoots along these underground stems. So some plants can be very aggressive with this. The picture on the right here is a picture of quackgrass, which has an aggressively rhizomatous root system. As you can see here, these white rhizomes that have been dug up, and then you can see that where there's nodes, it has rooted, and these plants here can function independently if those rhizome stems get separated. This plant over here on the left is an iris. This would be Siberian iris, and it is an example of a clump forming perennial, or one that produces an expanding crown. Bulbs, like tulips and daffodils, are underground storage organs containing a young embryonic plant. It is made up of a short stem and fleshy leaves. So onions are also an example of this category. So the stem in these plants is actually this area way down here at the bottom, right here along this basal plate that's called here. All these leaves then come off of that compressed stem at nodes, just like all other leaves do. And so the primary function then of this device is to have carbohydrate storage in all of these fleshy leaves, and then the bud produces, or the stem produces flower buds, which then in turn use up this stored carbohydrate until those leaves are basically recreated the following year by the leaves contributing to photosynthesis there. So here's an example of tulips and hyacinth and some narcissus all in this park, and you can see those. They're flowering here at this stage, but you can also see the leaves, so they're expending a great deal of energy to put those flowers out there, and that's coming from the stored energy that was in those fleshy leaves around those bulbs. A corm, on the other hand, is in some ways similar to bulbs, but it's made up of a compressed and thickened stem piece with a thin papery skin. And the thin papery skin is actually the remnants of the previous year's leaves. So the difference between corms and bulbs is that bulbs store their storage tissue in the leaves of the structure, and corms store it in an elongated, flattened stem instead of in the leaves. So some examples of this are crocus and gladiola. So these look a little bit more woody. They're usually very hard, and they're hard to cut into, whereas bulbs, if you're familiar with like an onion, are pretty easy to cut into. They're much softer. So I wanted to switch gears for a minute and talk about flowers. Flowers have some very important basic structures that we need to make sure that we understand. Starting down here at the bottom, we have these structures right here, which on the case of roses, for example, are green, and these are called sepals. Altogether, the group of them is called the calyx right here, and those serve to protect the flower as it's developing, and then they're usually cast aside, pushed away when the flower is opening. Moving up from that, we have the petals, and those are pictured here. We can see 3 of them here, and cross sections of 2, one here and the other one right here. All collectively together, they're called the corolla. Their purpose is primarily to attract pollinators. The flowers are usually divided into male and female parts. The female parts, shown here in the center of this diagram, there's 3 main parts. There's the main part called the pistil. All of these structures together are called the pistil. And the pistil consists of a stigma at the top, which is sticky. That's how I remember it, as the stigma is sticky. Then this supporting structure here that holds the stigma up, erect into the wind or for an insect to touch it. That's called the style. And then down at the base of this right here, we have the ovary. And inside this particular ovary, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ovules in there, or potentially 6 individual seeds. The male parts are called the stamens, and there's one shown right here. The top of the stamen, this elongated, swollen structure here is called the anther, and this is where the pollen is produced. And this supporting structure for that anther is called the filament, and it holds it up there so that insects or the wind can attach to the pollen and move it around. So here you can see the pistil consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary, and those are the female portions of the flower. The stamen, the male portion of the flower, consists of the anther and the supporting stamen. Flowers have three important processes. The first one of those is pollination, then fertilization, and then fruit development. Pollination, by definition, is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Sometimes this takes place between different plants and different flowers, where the pollen is transferred either by the wind or by an insect, and that's called cross-pollination. So wind, water, birds, insects, and so on can move the pollen that way. These types of pollen are usually heavy and don't move on the air, so they usually don't cause allergy problems for most people. Well, wind-pollinated plants do cause allergy problems because they produce copious amounts of very, very lightweight pollen grains that are very easily airborne. But if they're pollinated by water, birds, or insects, the pollen is usually very heavy and doesn't move on the wind. Self-pollination is when a flower provides its own pollen, or pollen gets from its own anthers back to the stigmas of the same flower. So what happens during the process of pollination is that we have a pollen grain which contains two internal cells in it, lands on top of a stigma, which is again sticky, and germinates. Now it has to be the right kind of pollen, and the stigma has to be receptive to it. And when they match, when there's a species match or a variety match, enzymes will break down the coat around the pollen grain, and these two pollen cells will emerge from the grain. One of these cells grows a tube down through the stigma and into the style. In fact, it grows all the way through the style. Once the pollen grows through the style, the other cell begins to move down with it and follow it into the ovaries. So once the two-cell pollen grain lands on the stigma and germinates, one cell grows the pollen tube, and the pollen tube grows through the style. Then that tube grows into one of the ovules. And that second cell, the fertilizing cell, actually then comes in behind it and will move into the ovary or to the ovule in the ovary and fertilize one of the eggs. And then we have seed development if fertilization is successful. So during fruit development, flower parts shrivel and drop, except for the ovary, and the ovary in many fruits develops to have a swollen fruit with one or more seeds, usually more than one. The ovary forms, in most cases, 3 fruit layers. There's the exocarp, which is the very outer skin. There's the mesocarp, which is the middle part of the skin. And then there's the endocarp, which is the inside. So on this orange here, the outer part of the skin, which is the real orange color, is the exocarp. The mesocarp is the white stuff just inside of that, and the endocarp is all of the fleshy orange that we like to eat. There are quite a few different types of fruit based on how the fruit is arranged or derived. And there's simple fruits where there's one flower and one fruit, and this includes most fruit. It doesn't necessarily mean there'll only be one seed in there. There can still be many seeds, but there's one flower and one fruit. So apples and oranges and lemons and those kinds of plants. And then there's plants with multiple fruits, where there's many flowers, but they combine in some way to form one fruit. And a great example of that is the pineapple. So here we have a picture of a pineapple, and you can see everywhere there's one of these kind of star-shaped things on the flower, or on the fruit. that was where there was an individual flower. So you can see there's many individual flowers there that kind of form those cool rows. And if you look at the picture to the right of it, you can actually see in the fruit that as the fruit enlarged, it kind of captured different portions of some of the floral parts during the fruit enlargement process. So basically you have lots of flowers, and then as their separate fruits develop, they touch and kind of fuse together. And you can see that here by the gaps in the fruit, indicating where the fruits didn't completely fuse together. There are also dry fruits that split open at maturity, like beans and peas and peanuts. And then there's indehiscent fruits, or those that don't split open at maturity, where the ovary is fused together. It doesn't have these slits along the side where the fruit can open easily. And those are our grains like wheat and barley and oats and acorns and strawberries. Now, strawberries are a little bit different. The actual seed of the strawberry, which is the fruit, is on the outside, and the fruit itself is actually the swollen base of the ovary that was actually holding the ovary up. And so that's a little bit of a different structure as well. So fleshy fruits include berries like tomatoes, grapes, oranges, where the entire ovary remains fleshy. Drupes are sometimes also called stone fruits. These are peaches, olives, plums, avocados, and these have a hard endocarp inside. Accessory fruits are those that are like apples and pears, and like watermelons, squash, where they have a hard rind, a hard exocarp, and a fleshy mesocarp, and then usually numerous seeds inside those. So seeds have a built-in food supply, and they germinate when dormancy is broken. So the process of germination is that if you have a ripe seed, it needs to be able to take up water and rehydrate those dried tissues. It needs to experience a proper temperature for germination, which for most plants is fairly warm, although some cooler season plants can easily germinate at soil temperatures of 50 degrees or even colder. Some require a scratched seed coat in order to let water into the seed, and that includes things like a lot of the legumes like Kentucky coffee tree or redbud. And then most seeds do not need light to germinate. They're normally going to be found buried, and that's where they'll experience the conditions right for them to germinate. But some seeds, particularly those that are very, very small, they need to sense light when they germinate, so that they know that they're close to the surface, so that they know that they don't have to expend a large amount of energy, which they don't have to spend, to try and push through multiple inches of soil or a lot of soil.